The morning of the wedding was filled with gentle excitement in the air. The sun rose early, painting the sky with soft gold and pink colors, as if nature itself wanted to bless the day. The bride's family busied themselves in the kitchen, filling trays with food and drinks for the guests who were expected. Laughter floated out of the open windows as cousins helped decorate the backyard with flowers, ribbons, and small lights. Children ran about, giggling, while the older relatives carefully arranged chairs under a white tent. The whole scene carried a sense of warmth, of community, and of love. The bride, a graceful woman with a calm smile, sat inside her room while her closest friends helped her prepare. She wore a beautiful gown, simple but elegant, with lace that trailed like soft clouds behind her. Her mother adjusted her veil, whispering blessings in her ear. For the bride, this day was more than a celebration of marriage, it was a symbol of everything she and her partner had overcome together. They had faced challenges, but today was about love and joy. Meanwhile, the groom was also preparing, though in a much quieter way. He stood before a mirror, straightening his tie and brushing down his suit. His calm demeanor gave away little, but his heart was full of gratitude. He had come a long way in life through education, public service, and years of dedication to his community. Yet here, on this morning, he was simply a man marrying the woman he loved. He had kept his higher position in government a quiet detail among many of his neighbors, not out of pride but out of humility. For him, titles mattered less than the way he treated people. Cars soon began pulling into the neighborhood. Relatives, friends, and colleagues stepped out in their best clothes, carrying gifts and smiles. Music floated into the air as a local band tuned their instruments. The energy grew as people embraced one another, greeting old friends and family who had traveled far to attend. The air was alive with cheer, the kind of joy that spreads easily from one person to another. But not everyone looked at the scene with kind eyes. Across the street, a woman stood behind her curtains, peeking out with a frown. She was a longtime resident of the neighborhood, someone who always seemed to find fault in others. Instead of seeing a joyful wedding, she saw cars blocking the street, people she didn't recognize, and a large gathering that made her feel uneasy. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the crowd grow larger, the laughter louder. Her thoughts were not filled with celebration but with suspicion. She muttered to herself, complaining about the noise and the people. She convinced herself that something was not right. Her own prejudice colored her view, and instead of walking across the street to greet the couple or simply enjoying the happiness of the day, she allowed fear and bias to take hold. She began to believe that what she was seeing might even be dangerous. The bride's family paid her no mind. They were too busy pouring drinks for the guests and ushering people to their seats. The children played with balloons, while older guests admired the decorations. Every detail of the event spoke of care and respect: white flowers carefully placed, candles ready to be lit for the evening, and soft music planned for later. When the groom stepped outside, a ripple of admiration passed through the crowd. His presence carried dignity, but he smiled kindly as he greeted his guests one by one. He hugged relatives, shook hands with friends, and even knelt down to laugh with the children. To those around him, he was more than just a public figure, he was a man of character, someone they trusted deeply. Yet, still, many in the neighborhood had no idea of his true role in government. The white neighbor across the street grew restless. She picked up her phone, hesitated for a moment, and then dialed. As she gave her report, her voice carried urgency and exaggeration. She described the scene not as a wedding but as a suspicious gathering of strangers. She complained about the music, the parked cars, and the large crowd. She hinted that something illegal might be happening. Her words were shaped not by truth but by fear and prejudice. Back at the wedding, the couple prepared to walk down the aisle. The bride's heart raced as she held her father's arm, ready to step into the sunlight where her groom waited. The music swelled, and guests turned in admiration. Cameras clicked, and people held their breath at the beauty of the moment. It was a scene of pure happiness, where two lives were about to join in front of family and friends. Unbeknownst to them, trouble was already on its way. Sirens were heard faintly in the distance, though most guests ignored them, thinking they belonged to something else in town. The bride focused on her steps, the groom on her face as she approached. For them, nothing else mattered in that instant. The white neighbor stood at her window still, arms crossed, waiting. She had made the call, and in her mind, she was protecting the neighborhood. She had no idea that the truth of who the groom was would soon leave her speechless. The scene in the backyard remained joyful, filled with claps and cheers, while somewhere down the road, official vehicles were approaching. The stage was unknowingly set for a dramatic turn of events that would forever change how this wedding was remembered. The ceremony was in full swing when the white neighbor sat on the edge of her couch with her phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her face was tense, her voice quick as she explained to the operator that something strange was happening across the street. She described the scene as if it were a crime in progress rather than a wedding. She exaggerated the number of cars, claimed the music was disturbing the peace, and suggested that the people gathering might be involved in suspicious activity. Each word she spoke carried more fear than fact, but the urgency in her voice made the operator take her seriously. Within moments, the call was passed to higher officials, and soon both local police and federal authorities were alerted. The neighbor hung up with a sense of satisfaction. She glanced once more out of her window, shaking her head. In her mind, she had done the right thing. She had convinced herself that she was protecting her neighborhood from strangers who didn't belong. She poured herself a glass of water and sat back, certain that her complaint would soon bring action. Across the street, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The bride and groom stood together under the decorated arch, holding hands, exchanging vows that brought tears to many eyes. Their voices trembled with emotion as they promised to love and honor each other through all of life's seasons. Guests smiled warmly, some dabbing their eyes with tissues, others squeezing the hands of loved ones beside them. For everyone present, it was a perfect moment, the kind of memory that stays in the heart forever. No one inside the tent had the slightest idea that a storm was quietly building just a few streets away. Police radios buzzed with details, agents were given quick instructions, and cars rolled out with lights flashing. In just minutes, what was meant to be a day of love would face an unexpected test. The neighbor returned to her window, peeking through the curtain with sharp eyes. She could see the wedding guests now dancing lightly to soft music, children playing with balloons, and servers carrying trays of food. She frowned, annoyed at the joy she saw, and muttered under her breath. Her prejudice blinded her from recognizing the innocence of the moment. She believed she had set in motion something that would put an end to the gathering. Meanwhile, the bride and groom were led to their seats for the reception. Plates of food were served, and laughter echoed through the air. Friends told stories of the couple, sharing how they had met, how they had overcome challenges, and how their love had grown strong through patience and respect. The bride's smile never faded as she listened to her family speak, and the groom nodded humbly as his friends praised his character. At the same time, a line of official vehicles turned into the neighborhood. Red and blue lights reflected off the windows, casting flickering colors on the houses. The sound of sirens grew louder until it was impossible to ignore. Children stopped playing, confused by the noise. A few guests looked toward the street, wondering what was happening. The music continued, but the mood began to shift as the flashing lights drew closer. The neighbor's eyes widened with satisfaction as she spotted the cars pulling in. She straightened her back, proud of what she thought was her accomplishment. She whispered to herself that she knew something was wrong all along. She had no idea what kind of mistake she had made or how quickly it would backfire. In the backyard, the band stopped playing as more guests turned toward the entrance. Confusion spread like ripples in water. Mothers pulled their children closer, and whispers grew louder. The bride looked at her groom with concern, while the groom calmly stood up, trying to reassure her with a gentle squeeze of her hand. Officers stepped out of their vehicles, their uniforms sharp under the afternoon sun. A few agents in plain suits followed, their expressions serious. They moved with authority, scanning the crowd, clearly expecting something much different than what they found. The laughter, the flowers, the food, and the music did not match the urgent call they had received. For a moment, even the officers hesitated, uncertain of how to proceed. One officer approached the entrance of the tent, his voice firm as he called out for the groom. His words carried over the crowd, bringing silence to the celebration. Guests exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what the authorities wanted. Some looked offended, others frightened, but everyone waited anxiously. The bride clutched her husband's hand tightly. Her eyes were wide with fear, but the groom remained calm. He whispered to her softly, telling her everything would be all right. Then, with steady steps, he walked toward the officers, his posture tall and confident. The guests watched in silence, their hearts pounding, wondering what could possibly happen next. The neighbor, still hidden behind her curtains, leaned forward eagerly, trying to see. She had expected chaos, perhaps even arrests, and her face carried a strange mix of curiosity and pride. She could not imagine that the man she had tried to expose was someone far beyond her assumptions. As the officers stood waiting, the groom approached them with respect, his voice steady as he asked what the matter was. The lead officer glanced down at his notes, still prepared to question him, unaware of the surprise about to unfold. Behind them, the wedding guests held their breath, waiting for answers. The neighbor smiled smugly, believing she had succeeded in stopping what she thought was wrong. But deep inside the tent, everyone else felt the weight of the moment, a mix of shock and confusion. The wedding that had begun with so much joy was now at a crossroads, caught between love and suspicion, between celebration and confrontation. The atmosphere was thick with tension, yet the groom's calm manner began to settle the unease. He knew the time had come to reveal who he truly was. The moment that followed would not only clear the doubts of the officers but also leave the neighbor frozen in disbelief. The scene stood still, guests silent, officers waiting, and the neighbor watching on the edge of a revelation that would change the story of this day forever. The air in the backyard wedding was thick with silence. Moments earlier, it had been filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Now, guests sat frozen in their chairs as the sight of police cars and federal vehicles lined up outside broke the rhythm of the celebration. The red and blue lights reflected against the white wedding tent, casting nervous shadows across the guests' faces. What had started as the happiest day of the bride and groom's life now felt like the edge of something uncertain. The bride's heart raced as she gripped the edge of her dress, whispering softly to her mother, who tried to calm her. Guests exchanged whispers, their voices filled with confusion. "Why are they here?" one aunt murmured. "What's going on?" asked a cousin, pulling his phone from his pocket as if to record. Children huddled close to their parents, wide-eyed and frightened, not understanding why so many serious-looking men had suddenly appeared. The groom, however, remained calm. He stood tall, his hand brushing against the bride's for reassurance before stepping forward. His face showed no anger, only quiet strength. As he approached the officers, the guests watched closely, each breath held in anticipation. The lead officer, a tall man with a firm voice, stepped ahead of his team. "We received reports of a suspicious gathering," he announced, scanning the crowd with a practiced eye. His words echoed under the tent, and many gasped at the suggestion. How could a wedding, decorated with flowers, balloons, and joyful people, ever be mistaken for something suspicious? The groom met his gaze steadily. "This is my wedding," he said calmly. His tone was respectful but carried quiet authority. The officer hesitated, glancing at the groom, then back at the crowd. It was not the chaos he had been told to expect. There were no signs of danger, no unlawful behavior, only tables with food, children holding balloons, and two families joined in celebration. A murmur rippled through the guests, some shifting in their chairs, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the absurdity of the interruption. From behind her curtain across the street, the white neighbor watched, her heart racing in a different way. She expected someone to be handcuffed, expected the officers to confirm her suspicions. She leaned forward eagerly, her eyes wide, certain that at any moment the groom would be escorted away. But what she did not realize was that she had not just called authorities on an ordinary man, she had called them on someone whose very identity would leave her speechless. The officer cleared his throat and asked the groom for identification. The guests stirred nervously, but the groom only nodded politely. He reached into his jacket pocket with calm movements, never breaking his steady composure. Slowly, he handed over his ID, a small card that carried with it far more weight than anyone expected. The officer took one look, and his entire expression shifted. His stern posture softened, his eyes widened slightly in surprise. He quickly checked the card again, as if making sure his eyes were not deceiving him. His team leaned closer, each one of them catching sight of the name and the title printed boldly on the card. A silence thicker than before settled over the scene. Guests leaned forward, straining to understand what was happening. The officer straightened himself and gave a small nod of respect. His voice, which had been firm and commanding moments earlier, was now measured and almost apologetic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice so that all could hear, "there has been a misunderstanding. This gentleman," he gestured toward the groom, "is the governor of the state." The words seemed to hang in the air, almost unreal. For a moment, no one moved. Then, gasps broke out across the crowd. The bride's mother covered her mouth in shock. The bride's eyes filled with tears, not of fear but of overwhelming pride. Guests whispered to one another, stunned by the revelation. The groom, still calm, gave a small smile, though he did not gloat. He placed a reassuring hand on his bride's shoulder, whispering softly to her. The officers quickly lowered their tone, speaking with respect, offering apologies for the disturbance. Some even extended their congratulations. Across the street, the neighbor froze completely. Her face drained of color as she realized the full extent of what she had done. She had not just interrupted a wedding, she had attempted to humiliate the governor on his most important day. Her body stiffened, her smug satisfaction replaced by pure dread. She stepped back from the curtain, unable to look any longer, her own actions crashing down on her like a wave of regret. Back in the tent, the guests slowly rose to their feet, applause breaking out as if to drown the tension that had lingered. They clapped not only for the couple but also for the way the groom handled the situation with dignity, patience, and strength. Children began smiling again, reassured by the cheers of the adults. The band, sensing the shift, began to play softly once more. The bride looked up at her groom with admiration, her heart swelling with pride. She had always known he was a man of character, a man who cared for people, but now everyone else saw just how deeply he carried himself with honor. Even in a moment that could have been humiliating, he showed nothing but grace. The officers, embarrassed but respectful, stepped back and prepared to leave. Before they did, one of them quietly shook the groom's hand, his voice low but sincere. "Congratulations, sir. And apologies for the disruption." The groom nodded, accepting the gesture. "Thank you," he replied softly. As the vehicle slowly pulled away, the neighbor stood frozen in her darkened living room, her heart pounding. She could already imagine how quickly the story would spread, not about the suspicious gathering she had claimed, but about the foolish neighbor who had called authorities on the governor's wedding. Her pride had turned into humiliation, and she knew there was no undoing it. Inside the tent, however, the atmosphere had changed once more. The interruption had given way to celebration again, though now with an even deeper sense of unity. The guests laughed louder, clapped harder, and raised their glasses higher, as if to make up for the moment stolen from them. The bride and groom returned to their seats, their hands entwined. Though their wedding had faced an unexpected test, it was clear to everyone that love and dignity had triumphed. What could have been a ruined day had instead become a story of strength, a reminder that true character reveals itself in moments of trial. As the evening sun dipped low, casting golden light across the decorations, the celebration carried on stronger than before. Guests danced, children played, and the band's joyful music filled the air once again. The wedding was not remembered for the interruption but for the way it rose above it, for the pride in seeing a leader stand calmly, and for the shock that silenced prejudice with truth. The neighbor across the street sat in her darkened room, unable to face the laughter that now rang even louder. The wedding she had tried to stop had become a moment of unforgettable victory. The moment the officer announced that the groom was the governor, a wave of disbelief swept across the wedding. For a few seconds, it felt like time itself had frozen. Guests blinked in astonishment, trying to process what they had just heard. Some gasped loudly, others covered their mouths with trembling hands, and a few even let out cheers that echoed under the white wedding tent. Children, too young to understand the weight of the announcement, simply clapped along with the adults, their innocent joy helping to ease the tension. The groom stood quietly, not boasting, not angry, just calm and dignified. His bride looked at him with eyes full of admiration, her heart swelling with pride. She had always known him as a humble man who valued kindness over recognition, but in this moment, everyone else was reminded of his true status. He was not only her husband but also the elected leader of the state, a man trusted by thousands, a man who carried the hopes of the people on his shoulders. The officers who had arrived with stiff expressions now shifted uncomfortably. Their posture softened, and some even lowered their heads slightly out of respect. The lead officer cleared his throat, his voice gentler than before. "Sir, we deeply apologize for the misunderstanding. We acted on a report that was misleading. We did not intend to disrupt your special day." The groom gave a small nod, his tone measured. "I understand. You were doing your duty. But perhaps next time, a moment of patience might prevent unnecessary worry." His words were not sharp but carried wisdom, reminding the officers of the weight of their actions without humiliating them. The guests erupted into applause, clapping not just for the governor but for the way he handled the situation with grace, respect, and dignity. The applause was long and loud, breaking the tension like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Even the bride's grandmother, who had been clutching her rosary nervously moments earlier, joined in the clapping, her smile wide with relief. Across the street, the white neighbor stood behind her curtain, frozen in horror. Her earlier pride had vanished, replaced by sheer panic. She had thought she was exposing something wrong, but instead she had humiliated herself. She had tried to tarnish a day of joy, only to reveal her own prejudice. She sank into her chair, her face pale, replaying the moment again and again in her mind. The governor. She had called the authorities on the governor's wedding. Her knees trembled at the thought of what the community would say once the story spread. Back at the wedding, the bride wiped a tear from her cheek as she leaned against her husband. "You handled that so beautifully," she whispered. He smiled gently, squeezing her hand. "This day is about us, not about them," he said softly. "Let's not let anything take that away." The band, sensing the mood had lifted, began playing again, this time a lively tune that invited people back to the dance floor. Children resumed their games, chasing balloons and laughing loudly, while guests lined up to hug the couple. Each embrace carried not just love but also admiration. They were proud to know a leader who stayed humble even in such a moment. The officers slowly stepped back, making their way toward their vehicles. Before leaving, one younger officer hesitated, then turned back and extended his hand to the groom. "Congratulations, sir," he said quietly. "It's an honor to serve under a leader like you." The groom shook his hand firmly, thanking him. That small gesture left many guests nodding with approval, their faith in respect and kindness restored. As the vehicles drove away, the wedding returned to its rhythm. Plates of food were passed around again, glasses were filled, and laughter replaced the earlier silence. Guests whispered among themselves, sharing their amazement. "Can you believe it?" "The governor," one woman said, fanning herself. "And look how calm he was," another added, shaking her head in admiration. Stories of the moment began to grow, already being retold with excitement as if people were part of history. The bride's father stood up and tapped his glass to get everyone's attention. "My friends," he said proudly, "we came here today to celebrate love, and though we faced a strange interruption, love has proven stronger. Let us not remember this day for the disruption but for the joy, the unity, and the strength we witnessed." His words were met with cheers, and glasses were raised high in a toast. The groom leaned close to his bride. "You see," he whispered with a smile. "Nothing can ruin today." She laughed softly, her nervousness gone, and kissed him on the cheek. Meanwhile, in her darkened house, the neighbor paced back and forth. Her phone buzzed with messages from other residents who had noticed the flashing lights. She didn't dare respond. Shame pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. She knew people would soon connect her to the call. After all, she had made her complaints about the couple loud enough in the past. Now, her prejudice had been revealed, and the whole neighborhood would know. Back at the celebration, the bride and groom took to the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. The music slowed, and the crowd gathered around, clapping gently in rhythm. The bride's dress shimmered under the string lights, and the groom's calm smile never faded as he twirled her gently. For them, the interruption had already faded into the background. All that remained was love. The guests cheered when the dance ended, and soon the dance floor was full. Laughter rang out, shoes tapped against the ground, and the sound of music filled every corner of the yard. Children spun in circles, their hands sticky with sweets, while elders clapped along to the beat. The earlier fear had turned into joy, and the celebration was stronger than ever. People began taking photos, eager to capture not only the beauty of the wedding but the unforgettable story that had just unfolded. They knew this was a moment they would tell for years, the day the governor's wedding was interrupted by a misguided call, and how he rose above it with dignity. As the night wore on, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow across the gathering. The bride and groom sat together, surrounded by family, their smiles constant. The bride's head rested on her husband's shoulder, her heart filled with gratitude. "This will be a story we tell our children one day," she said quietly. He chuckled, replying, "Yes, and we'll remind them that love always speaks louder than prejudice." The neighbor, alone in her house, could still hear the music drifting across the street. Each cheer and laugh felt like a reminder of her mistake. She closed her curtains tightly, but nothing could block out the sound of unity and joy rising from the celebration. That night, as the stars filled the sky, the wedding continued in full spirit. Guests danced until their feet ached, stories were shared late into the evening, and the bond between two families grew stronger than ever. Though the day had carried an unexpected twist, it ended as it had begun, with love shining brighter than anything else. The reveal had not only silenced doubt but also turned the wedding into a symbol of dignity and resilience. And while the neighbor hid in her silence, the couple stepped forward into their future, knowing that their love had triumphed over suspicion, and that their story would be remembered forever. The evening grew calmer as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of purple and orange. The wedding guests, who had earlier been shaken by flashing lights and unexpected officers, were now relaxed and joyful again. The tension of the afternoon had melted away, leaving only warmth, laughter, and the sweet music of celebration. The bride and groom sat together at the head table, smiling at their friends and family, their hands intertwined. The guests had not stopped talking about what had happened earlier. "Can you believe it?" one uncle whispered as he raised his glass. "The governor himself, sitting right here, among us, At his own wedding. His words carried both amazement and pride. Another guest added, and the way he handled it with calmness, with grace. That's true leadership. Their words spread from table to table, and soon everyone was praising the groom not only as a husband but as a man of character. The bride's parents, once worried that the day had been ruined, now felt an even greater pride. Their daughter had married a man who proved his strength not through anger but through dignity. They watched the couple dance and laugh together, their hearts full of gratitude that love had shone brighter than fear. Meanwhile, across the street, the white neighbor sat alone in her dark living room. The curtains were drawn tightly, but she could still hear the faint echoes of joy drifting from the wedding. Every laugh, every cheer, felt like a reminder of her mistake. She replayed the moment in her mind, how the officers had arrived with authority, how she had expected the groom to be embarrassed, and how instead she had been the one left frozen in shock. Her heart sank deeper each time she thought of how the officers had addressed him, Governor. She imagined how quickly the story would spread. By morning, neighbors would be whispering about the call. Some might even confront her, asking why she had done such a thing. She realized there would be no excuse strong enough to cover her prejudice. Her pride had turned into regret, and her attempt to spoil someone else's joy had only brought humiliation upon herself. Back at the wedding, the celebration grew livelier. Children ran with sparklers in their hands, their laughter brightening the night. The band played a mix of cheerful songs, and soon even the elders joined the dance floor, their movements slower but full of happiness. The bride's grandmother, who had been nervous earlier, clapped her hands to the rhythm, her face glowing with joy. The bride leaned close to her husband and whispered, "This day turned out more memorable than we could have imagined." The groom chuckled softly, his voice calm. "Yes," he said, "life always surprises us. But what matters is how we face it." His words carried wisdom, and the bride felt reassured. She knew that with him by her side, every challenge would be met with patience and strength. As the night continued, guests raised their glasses for another toast. One of the groom's closest friends stood up and spoke loudly, his voice filled with emotion. "Today, we celebrate more than a marriage. We celebrate dignity, love, and unity. We saw how hate tried to enter, but love stood taller. And we all witnessed the strength of a man who, even when tested, never lost his calm." To the bride and groom. The guests lifted their glasses high, their cheers echoing under the starry sky. The couple stood together, thanking their guests for being part of their special day. The bride's voice trembled with emotion as she said, "This wedding has shown us not just our love but the love of all of you. We will never forget how you stood by us." Her words brought tears to many eyes, and the applause that followed was long and heartfelt. Meanwhile, the story of the day had already begun to spread beyond the tent. Guests sent messages and photos to friends, telling them about the unbelievable turn of events. Some posted on social media, describing how prejudice had tried to spoil a wedding but instead revealed the truth in the most powerful way. The neighbors' actions had already become a tale of warning, a reminder of how quickly suspicion can turn into shame. As lanterns floated into the night sky, the bride and groom shared a quiet moment together. They looked up at the glowing lights drifting higher, symbols of hope and new beginnings. "This will be a story our children and grandchildren will hear," the groom said softly. The bride nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes, but I want them to remember it not for the interruption, but for the love that continued." Across the street, the neighbor sat silently, the sound of lanterns popping faintly in the sky above. She pulled her blanket tighter around her, wishing she could turn back time. But the truth was unchangeable. She had tried to ruin a day of joy, and instead, she had exposed her own bitterness to everyone. The wedding ended with laughter and cheers as the couple prepared to leave. Guests lined up with sparklers, creating a glowing path for the bride and groom to walk through. They held hands tightly, smiling at the sea of faces who cheered them on. Every step they took was filled with the promise of a future together, one built not only on love but also on the strength of dignity. As the couple drove away, the sound of their guests' voices faded, but the memory of the day stayed bright in their hearts. They had faced an unexpected challenge, yet their love had risen above it. The neighbor's actions, meant to cast a shadow, had instead shone a light on the truth. For the guests, it was a wedding they would never forget. For the couple, it was proof that love, respect, and patience will always overcome prejudice. And for the neighbor, it was a painful lesson that suspicion and judgment only lead to shame. The night ended with the stars shining brightly above, as if to remind everyone that light will always conquer darkness. And so, the wedding of the governor and his bride was remembered not for the interruption, but for the triumph of love and dignity over fear and doubt.